Today we're going to talk about the Crawlmaster Mini V3 ready to run ESC. Now you may have to let me know in the comments. You may be familiar with the layout of this hardware of our new ESC. This is a Crawlmaster Mini V3 and it comes in a ready to run version. It also comes with a programmer, which unfortunately is not compatible with our older ESCs, but I am working on that. The next batch should have these be compatible with pretty much any AM32 ESC. But first, let's talk about this particular ESC, what it is, and etc. If you do have any questions though, make sure you leave them down below. This is based on a 40 amp architecture. In reality, I would say that this is actually 25 amp ESC. However, many of y'all are familiar with this hardware. I have changed some of the components to make it my own, some of the hardware, and we have our own branch of firmware on this. This did get cut with the 1.99 AM32, which is one of the smoothest that's available, and it has some of our own extra protections added to it as well. Now, those are stuff that hopefully you won't really be able to tell when you're driving it as compared to other ESCs. However, I will say it makes these a lot more reliable and it makes it much less likely to cut off if you're doing like a forwards and backwards move on there. So that's one of the bigger changes that we did to the firmware versus just the stock AM32 that you could target to pretty much any ESC out there. Along with that, we made these where they have pretty much a ready to run construction. We have XT60s on here. We just have our single RX wire. We have our JSD coming off for your servos or whatever other ancillaries and accessories that you may want to use, as well as 4mm bullets ready to go. Female side, of course, for the ESC. So these will plug right in. Let's see, I've got a revolver in here. These will plug right in, and I made the lengths of the wires not so long, not nearly as long as some of the other ones that we've had, so that when you plug it into one of our motors or a battery lead, that you're not going to have, you know, an extra foot of wires on the inside of the vehicle. So there you go. There you go. Just like that. All right. So yes, as I said, these are really a 25 amp ESC, but it is the 40 amp package that pretty much is ubiquitous in the industry at this point. We did keep the heatsink that you're probably familiar with, and you know, my thought was, why try to obfuscate where this hardware started? Y'all are going to figure it out one way or another anyways. So let's actually talk about the hardware and how these are different from the V2. I will explain that this is not a replacement for the V2. This is actually just something that's going to be sold alongside the V2. And if I come out with an upgrade to the V2, it's probably going to be called the V4, and we'll sell the V3 and the V2, or the V3 and the V4 together. So looking at these two, this is the V2, this here is the V3. As you can see, the big difference on these is actually going to be the MOSFET size. And these MOSFETs on the V3 are much smaller. So this one is typically called a 40 amp package. And this one, if I were going to name it like all the other ESC makers in the industry, I would call the V2 actually a 120 amp package, but it's 40 amp continuous. It doesn't have any heat sinking other than what you install on there for the wires, but as you can see, these MOSFETs are absolutely ginormous. It's about 2.5 times less resistance than the MOSFETs on the V3. So if you're looking to do a much faster motor, let's say a 2500 kV revolver on 4S LiPo, you definitely want to stick with a V2. Now we will be cutting the 1.99 firmware and testing on that to see if we can smooth it out, because right now the V3 is actually smoother than our V2 by just a little bit on that sine transfer, where it goes from the sine into the 6-step, but we're going to be working on that. That is one of the nice things about the open source AM32, and also us being the only company that actually pays the AM32 for every unit. So you might ask yourself, why would I choose this hardware versus any of the other ones out there? And one of the big differences is that we do donate from every single ESC into that AM32 project to make sure that it keeps going and to make sure that Pete actually has resources to do this, and he's not just spending his time for essentially nothing, because up until this point, up until we started supporting it, Pete has made $0 from the AM32 project. So it not only feels good for me to help him out with that, but it makes sure that this progresses. And a lot of the features that we actually have within the AM32 now for all the open source stuff is due to me asking Pete to do it, paying him, and then saying, hey, you can release that out into the open. So when you support us through the AM32 project, you are supporting it more directly than you could through another company. So the specs for this new ESC are our 2 to 4S LiPo input, that it has a 3 amp 7.4 volt BEC on the output. It also comes conformally coated. I would recommend that you add a little bit of the cow formal if you want to really dunk this thing, but it is conformally coated. It'll be water resistant, dirt resistant, all of that. It also does not have the on-off switch that is likely to fail and kind of a pain to mount in your vehicle, so when you plug it in, it is on. All the rest of the specs you can find on the website, as well as the files for the programmer and the driver for our programming chip. So let's see, what else do we have here? That's pretty much the ESC. Like I was saying, if you do want to do the faster motors, like a 2500 kV motor on 4-cell LiPo, you want to stick with that V2 for right now. But if you're doing an 1800 kV on 4-cell, absolutely, we've tested these very hard and it works very well. And if you want to go up to about a 2250 kV on 3-cell is where we've tested so far, but your mileage may vary, and depending on your rig weight, your driving style, your terrain, and your final gear down in the vehicle, you may be able to get away with some of those faster kV motors on 4S with this as well. It's very stable on 4S. It actually has components that are rated above, much above 4S, 35 volt components pretty much. So it's not gonna smoke, it's not gonna pop if you accidentally, blip your throttle back and forth. And like I said, some of the protections that we have on our firmware branch versus the main public AM32 branch is actually gonna help that as well. So there you go. Maybe you have more questions about this. If you do, leave them down below and we'll do our best to get to them. Until then, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. Go to holmeshobbies.com for more information.